RAF Marham, Norfolk, the 14th of January 1944, 3 o'clock in the morning. The dispersal pan is dark and cold, not frozen hard. The January ground is more damp than iced, though a light frost is beginning to settle on the metal surfaces. But cold enough that the two ground crew loading Mosquito DZ469 have stopped feeling their fingers. They work by torchlight at the open bomb bay, hand-cranking 4 500-pound general-purpose weapons up through the wooden belly of the aircraft on cable hoists. Each weapon arrived from the bomb store 2 hours earlier, already fitted with its long-delay fuse. The cable ratchet makes a rhythmic clicking in the still air as each bomb rises into position. The night smells of fuel and oil and wet Norfolk grass. The Mosquito is built almost entirely from wood, a laminated sandwich of spruce and balsa that looks deceptively like furniture when you're standing under it at night. Up close, it smells of dope, the nitrate lacquer used to seal the plywood shell, and of the Havilland hydraulic oil that works into everything it touches. The two Merlin 21 engines sit cold and still in their wooden nacelles, exhaust stubs pointing aft into the dark. The bomb bay accepts the last weapon. One of the crew runs his torch along the closed bay door, checking the seal, then steps back. DZ469 sits ready. Squadron leader Tom Smith is in the flight hut 30 yards away, drinking tea from a chipped enamel mug and reading his target briefing by lamplight. The briefing is a laminated map sheet with the route drawn on it in grease pencil. Outbound over the North Sea to avoid the German coastal radar chain for as long as possible, then the dog-leg north over Denmark, then southeast across the North German plain to the city. The oboe timing cards are beside the map, the specific moment of bomb release calculated to within seconds by the ground stations in England. The flak concentration sheet is there too, and Smith has read it before and won't read it again tonight. He knows Berlin's defences well enough. He knows the route by a kind of muscle memory. He knows the Merlin's fuel consumption on the outbound climb at cruise power and on the run-in at the oboe approach altitude. And he knows the reserve required on the return. And he knows that all of it fits together only if everything goes right. No significant headwinds, no routing deviations. The oboe signal holding cleanly through the approach. He has flown the route before and come back. He is aware, in the precise, unsentimentalized way of men who calculate these things professionally, that the margin for things not going right is narrow. He finishes his tea. He buttons his collar, pulls on his flying gloves in the hut — there is no point removing them for the walk across dispersal — and steps out into the dark. The walk from the flight hut to DZ469 takes about 40 seconds at a steady pace. The aircraft's silhouette against the night sky is immediately familiar. The twin tail, the slight shoulder wing sweep, the narrow engine nacelles. At this hour, in this weather, the shape is entirely grey against very dark grey. Smith can see the ground crew completing their checks by torchlight. He can see the port engine cowling, and he can see that a man is standing there, waiting. Leading aircraftman Banks is wearing oil-stained overalls over his uniform, a torch hooked to his belt, a small spanner in his right hand. He has been at the aircraft for approximately 90 minutes. He does not step forward when Smith approaches. The two men don't speak. Smith nods. Banks taps the cowling once with the spanner. A single, deliberate metallic contact, not accidental. That single tap means the boost control valve has been recalibrated and the mixture cocks reset. The Merlin 21s on this aircraft will pull approximately 13 pounds of boost on the climb and 11 on cruise, beyond what the Air Ministry's 1943 operating notes authorise for any Mosquito in Bomber Command. The most specific estimate for what this provides, from the accounts of men who flew these aircraft in this configuration, is roughly 40 miles of additional operational radius. On the Berlin route in the winter of 1943-44, that margin is the difference between reaching the target with fuel to spare and not returning. Banks holds the rank of leading aircraftman. That is the second lowest non-commissioned grade in the RAF, above aircraftman, below corporal, with no formal technical authority attached to it. He holds no commission, no decoration, no entry on any squadron honours board. What he is doing at the cowling of DZ469 is a court-martial offence under King's regulations. The pilots who fly modified aircraft are aware of it in the most economical way possible. They know only that when Banks taps the cowling once, the aircraft can reach Berlin. Coventry, by the early 1920s, was the engine of British manufacturing. Daimler had been producing cars there since 1897, and the company's works on Radford Lane employed hundreds of precision machinists and engineers who had come to specialise in components that couldn't be made anywhere else in Britain with the same consistency. Among those specialisations was aero-engine valve work. An engineering survey from the period describes the Daimler Coventry works as having become specialists in aero-engine valves, work that persisted throughout most of the 1920s. Aero-engine valves in the 1920s were a fundamentally different problem from car valves. They operated at higher temperatures, under greater cyclic stress, with smaller tolerances for dimensional variation. Getting them right required understanding failure modes intimately, disassembly at the point of failure, measurement of dimensional changes, revision of specification, and back to manufacture. The culture was empirical and iterative, and merciless about imprecision. Frederick Lanchester served as technical consultant to the Daimler Company from 1909. His documented role at Daimler was the Daimler Knight engine for the car range, automotive rather than aero engine specifically, but his archive, held at Coventry University Library, represents a man whose theoretical work shaped the British aviation industry. Lanchester had published The Circulation Theory of Lift in 1907. He had written Aircraft in Warfare in 1916. He was a mathematician working at a manufacturing company, and the intellectual atmosphere he brought to Daimler treated the gap between what the specifications said and what the physics of the situation required not as a bureaucratic boundary, but as an engineering question, something to be measured, analysed and quantified until the answer was certain. By the early 1930s, according to the accounts that have come down, Banks had moved from Coventry to Rolls-Royce at Derby. The train journey took about an hour. The distance in engineering culture was measured differently. Derby was where the serious British aero-engine work happened. By 1932, Rolls-Royce was developing the Kestrel, a supercharged V12 delivering around 500 horsepower, the direct mechanical ancestor of everything that followed, and beginning the private venture work on the PV-12 prototype that first ran on the Derby testbeds in October 1933, 6 months after Henry Royce's death. The PV-12 became the Merlin. A development fitter at Derby wasn't a production worker. He didn't assemble engines off a jig and send them down the line. He worked at the boundary between what the design specified and what the manufacturing process could achieve. He assembled engines that were sometimes being run to destruction, loaded at or beyond their limits until something failed, then stripped at the failure point to understand what gave way first and precisely why. He measured dimensional changes in crankshaft journals, big end bearings, and valve stems under different loading regimes, building the data record that told the design office whether its limits were correctly placed. Whether the numbers in the operating specification were correctly conservative for a production engine, built to adequate tolerances by adequate fitters in field conditions, or whether they were simply cautious. The test cell at Derby was a specific physical environment. Engines ran under full load behind blast-proof enclosures, connected to dynamometers that recorded torque against RPM. The noise during a maximum power run was physically painful without hearing protection, a deep, sustained mechanical roar that the Derby factory workers could hear across the site. After the run, when the engine was shut down and cooling, the fitter disassembled the specific components that had been under the highest stress. The crankshaft bearings first, measured with a dial gauge accurate to 1/4 of an inch. Then the piston crowns, then the valve seats. Each measurement was recorded. Each was compared against the previous test and against the specification. Over hundreds of test cycles, the picture of what the engine would actually sustain accumulated with mathematical precision. Banks spent approximately 8 years at Derby before the war. During that time, the Merlin developed from the PV-12's first cautious runs to the production variants flying in Hurricanes and Spitfires during the Battle of Britain. He had watched the approved performance limits revised upward at each step, as the accumulated test evidence provided formal justification. Merlin 2. Approximately 1,030 horsepower. By the time Stanley Hooker redesigned the supercharger geometry at Derby in the early wartime years, raising its efficiency from 68 to 76%, the engine was producing significantly more power at altitude than anything the 1933 prototype had demonstrated possible. Each revision required formal Air Ministry approval of new operating notes. Each revision took months. At every point in that cycle, the development fitters at Derby already knew what the next revision was going to be, because they had measured it. Banks carried 2 numbers when the National Service Act of 1940 put him in the RAF at age 33. One was the official figure, the approved boost ceiling as published. The other was the performance the engine would actually sustain, measured across hundreds of test cycles on development engines, visible in the wear signature of components stripped and examined at known operating histories. The gap between those 2 numbers wasn't a secret at Derby. It was knowledge that moved slowly through official channels and quickly through the hands of people who had spent years measuring it. The RAF's classification process for incoming tradesmen had no mechanism for distinguishing a man who had spent 8 years on pre-production Merlin development from a man who had spent 3 years on a production line. Both were fitters. Both became leading aircraftmen. The rank's ceiling didn't move for accumulated practical knowledge. It moved for commissioned service, and Banks wasn't offered a commission. Too old for aircrew, too specialised to waste on general maintenance. Holding a rank that gave him formal authority over nothing. He arrived at RAF Marham in 1942. The aircraft on dispersal were Mosquito B Mark IVs. Their engines were Merlin 21s. He had worked on the engine's grandparent design at Derby and watched it develop through every variant since the PV-12's first runs. He arrived at Marham carrying more practical Merlin knowledge than most officers at the station, holding the second lowest non-commissioned grade in the RAF. The Mosquito B Mark IV had been designed from first principles as an aircraft whose only defence was performance. Geoffrey de Havilland's original premise, elaborated through letters to Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman in 1938 and 1939, was that a sufficiently fast, sufficiently clean aircraft didn't need defensive armament, because no fighter could reliably catch it. The Air Ministry's scepticism was genuine and extended. They preferred armed bombers and said so repeatedly through the development period. But when the prototype first flew at Hatfield on the 25th of November 1940, 2 Merlin 21 engines installed, driving 3-bladed de Havilland hydromatic constant-speed propellers, it proved faster than the Spitfire at service altitude, and carried twice the bomb load of a Blenheim without a single gun. The subsequent procurement was rapid. The Merlin 21, designated RM3SM in the original de Havilland specification, was described in the Freeman contract as a 2-speed, single-stage, supercharged engine producing 1,280 horsepower at rated output. The performance documentation for various Merlin variants across the wartime development sequence showed a wide range of approved boost ceilings. The Merlin X at plus 10 pounds per square inch, the Merlin 10X at plus 14. Later variants reaching plus 16 to plus 18 as fuel quality improved and the engineering case for higher limits was progressively made to the Air Ministry's satisfaction. The Merlin 21 specification at full output sits at plus 16 psi in the published data. What the Air Ministry's operational notes specified as the approved ceiling for Mosquito operations in 1943 can't be confirmed precisely from surviving documents. What is confirmed, running through every account of wartime Merlin development, is the principle. The published operational limit was more conservative than the engine's actual sustainable capability. Rolls-Royce's own internal data confirmed the gap, and the formal process for closing it was measured in months, while the operational need was measured in nights. The boost control valve was the mechanical guardian of the approved limit. The throttle connected to the engine through a pressure-sensing regulator, a compact housing containing a spring-loaded piston that responded to manifold pressure from the supercharger output. When pressure reached the approved ceiling, the piston moved to open a relief passage, bleeding excess boost to hold the manifold pressure steady at the approved level. The system was reliable and precise, which was precisely the problem. It couldn't distinguish between a conservative limit set for fleet-wide application across all production standards and a limit that reflected the genuine physical ceiling of a development standard engine operating under skilled supervision. It simply held the pressure it was calibrated to, regardless of which of those two things the setting represented. Recalibrate the spring preload, the pressure at which the piston engaged, and more manifold pressure reached the cylinders before the regulator intervened. Adjust the carburetor mixture simultaneously, richer to optimize combustion at the higher pressure, and avoid the detonation that an undertreated fuel-air mixture produced at elevated boost. And the Merlin 21 gained access to a portion of its actual capability that the operating notes had withheld. Bounded by the same physics that determined Rolls-Royce's own internal performance envelope, more permissive than the Air Ministry's published limit, while remaining inside the manufacturer's data for what the engine could sustain. Stanley Hooker, who had joined Rolls-Royce in 1938 as a mathematician, and spent the early war years redesigning the Merlin supercharger, understood this territory precisely. His memoir, Not Much of an Engineer, published by Airlife in 1984, describes the formal, institutional process by which Rolls-Royce pushed the Merlin's approved performance upward through the war. Documented, tested, submitted, slowly authorized. The secondary record attributes a passing reference on page 134 of that book to field modification activity at Marham. Whether Banks is named or whether only the practice is mentioned isn't recoverable from the available excerpts of the text. The risk Banks was accepting on behalf of the engines was calculable. Rolls-Royce specified the Merlin's crankshaft journal diameter tolerance at plus or minus 1/4 of an inch, a standard of precision that made bearing wear a reliable indicator of operating history. Running above approved boost accelerated bearing load at a rate that a man who had spent years measuring Merlin wear signatures under development conditions could estimate from first principles. Over the duration of a single Berlin sortie, the engine would function well. Over a series of sorties, the quarterly maintenance return would show wear accumulating above the predicted rate. That signature was what the Air Ministry would eventually see. 105 Squadron had taken delivery of its first Mosquito B Mark IV at Swanton Morley in November 1941. By September 1942, the unit was at Marham, and the winter and spring of 1943 produced the operations that established the aircraft and the squadron in public memory. The Oslo raid in 1942, Operation Oyster against the Philips factory at Eindhoven in December of that year. 20 Mosquitoes from 105 and 139 squadrons attacking in formation at low level across Holland. Then, the 30th of January 1943, 3 Mosquitoes from Marham, timed to arrive over Berlin as Goering was scheduled to address a parade marking the 10th anniversary of Nazi power, bombing the main broadcasting station at 11 in the morning and keeping Goering off the air for more than an hour. Squadron leader Reggie Reynolds led the morning wave with navigator Ted Sizemore. All 3 aircraft returned to Marham. It was the first British daylight raid on Berlin, and it proved, in the clearest possible terms, that a Mosquito B Mark IV could reach the city and come back. What it didn't prove was that the aircraft could sustain a winter Pathfinder campaign against the city at approved settings across multiple sorties with the margins that a sustained campaign required. By June 1943, 105 Squadron had joined No. 8 Pathfinder Force Group under Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, transferring from No. 2 Group and taking on the target marking role for Bomber Command's main force. In the summer of 1943, a series of flight exchanges between 105 and 109 Squadron at Marham established 105 as the second oboe squadron. 109 had pioneered the system, and now 105 was equipped with it, becoming the second pathfinding unit using the radio navigation method that placed bombs consistently within 100 yards of the aiming point. 109 Squadron moved to Marham from Whiten in July 1943. By autumn, the 2 units together constituted the primary oboe pathfinding capability for 8 Group, sending Mosquitoes to Germany on most nights the weather allowed. Oboe guided an aircraft along a precisely calculated curved track that passed directly over the target at a fixed altitude and fixed airspeed. Its accuracy was the reason the Pathfinder force was using it. By 1944, as Alan Hayworth, a navigator with 105 Squadron who completed 73 oboe operations from Marham, recorded in a published account, the system placed bombs within 100 yards of the aiming point consistently enough that the method had become standard practice for precision target marking. Its inflexibility was the other side of that accuracy. An oboe Mosquito flew the same approach every time, at a fixed height, at a fixed speed. The German anti-aircraft batteries around Berlin had been watching the system's geometry since January 1943. By the winter of 1943-44, their radar-controlled searchlights could acquire an aircraft on the oboe approach path in seconds of crossing the outer marking beacon. Charles Parker, a navigator with 8 Group's fast night striking force, who flew Mosquitoes to Berlin from RAF Whiten, recorded the experience in his 1989 oral history interview held at the International Bomber Command Center Digital Archive. On his second operational night with the squadron, his first trip to Berlin, the targeting run produced exactly the sequence the German defences were calibrated for. A whitish-blue radar-controlled master searchlight acquired the aircraft, held it, and every other searchlight in the area slaved onto the master beam, creating a cone of illumination the pilot had to fly through for 3 to 4 minutes before breaking free. The flak over Berlin was heavier than anything else Parker flew against across his entire tour. Oboe required you to be exactly where they knew you would be, at exactly the altitude and airspeed they were measuring for. The squadron had formally requested authority to operate at higher boost settings. The requests went to Group HQ and to the Air Ministry. They came back each time as no change to the operating notes. The institutional process for revising the Merlin's approved limits required formal testing, documented evidence accumulation, and submissions through Air Ministry technical channels. The same slow cycle that had governed every previous limit revision throughout the war. The process worked. Over time, it produced genuinely justified upward revisions in the Merlin's approved performance. But it operated on a timescale measured in months, and the winter 1943-44 Berlin campaign was measured in nights. The space Banks used for his modification work wasn't a dedicated facility. It was time. Hours spent at the dispersal pan after his authorized daily inspection schedule was complete, working by torchlight in the cold, with parts drawn from the squadron's authorized stores and logged as routine maintenance consumption. Nothing in the maintenance documentation recorded the purpose. The procedure on any given aircraft took approximately 90 minutes. The boost control valve assembly on the Merlin 21 was accessible from the top of the engine once the relevant cowling panel was removed, 4 Zeus fasteners, the panel pivoting up and back on its hinge. The regulator housing sat forward of the firewall on the port side, plumbed into the induction system between the supercharger outlet and the throttle body. Banks had a specific adjustment procedure, not trial and error. A measured change in the spring preload produced a measurable change in the relief pressure threshold, which produced a predictable change in maximum manifold pressure, which corresponded to a calculable increase in available boost at a given throttle setting. He had done this calibration work on development engines at Derby for years. The physics didn't change because the setting was a Marham dispersal pan rather than a Derby test cell. The mixture adjustment was a separate operation, requiring a different access panel aft of the firewall. The carburetor needle position controlled the fuel enrichment characteristic across the throttle range. At higher boost, the mixture needed to run richer to keep combustion optimal and prevent detonation. Done incorrectly, the engine would run lean at the higher boost setting and detonate, not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly and destructively. Done correctly, to the same standard that the Derby development data specified, combustion remains stable across the new operating envelope. When he was done, Banks replaced the access panels and wiped the cowling surfaces clean. The work left no visible trace. It showed up only in the engine's behavior under load, a distinctly different throttle response on takeoff and climb, a faster cruise speed in level flight at the same throttle setting, and in the bearing wear data that accumulated over time in the quarterly maintenance return. He kept a notebook. According to Hyam's published account in Bases of Air Strategy, the notebook recorded each modification event, the aircraft serial number, the date, the specific calibration settings applied to the boost control valve and carburetor mixture. The Rolls-Royce Heritage Trust Archive at Derby reportedly holds the notebook as a donated item. The archive is currently closed for a cataloguing project expected to complete in 2026. And the secondary record describes more than 80 separate modification events recorded in its pages, covering operations across the winter of 1943-44 to Berlin, the Ruhr, Hamburg and Munich. The modifications spread from aircraft to aircraft, not through any formal decision, but through observation. The pilots who flew modified Mosquitoes recognized the difference in the moment they pushed the throttle forward for takeoff, a fuller, more authoritative response from the Merlins on the climb, a cruise speed that arrived earlier than the approved power settings delivered. Most of the captains who flew at Marham in the winter of 1943-44 had enough Merlin experience to understand, at least approximately, what they were feeling. They didn't ask about it. Asking was an invitation to have the modification reversed, or to put Banks in a position where he would have to account for his work formally to someone who might not share the station commander's disposition to look in a different direction. The protocol that developed between Banks and the aircraft captains was wordless and required no documentation. If an aircraft had been modified, Banks would be at the port engine cowling when the pilot arrived for his pre-flight walk-around. One tap on the metal with the spanner. One quiet, deliberate contact, not accidental. The pilot acknowledged it with a nod and completed his walk-around. Nothing was entered in the Form 700, the aircraft maintenance document that formed the official record of the aircraft's state. Nothing was spoken to anyone not standing at that dispersal pan in the cold and dark. The Marham station commander understood that his aircraft were performing beyond what the Air Ministry's operating notes would predict. His response was to make no formal inquiry into the cause. The operational benefit was observable in the sortie data, aircraft completing routes that the approved numbers made marginal, returning with fuel reserves that the approved cruise settings shouldn't have produced. The question its cause required him to formally investigate was one whose answer he couldn't afford to have on official record while the Berlin campaign was running. Reynolds, in his 1971 memoir, estimated the modification's effect at approximately 40 miles of additional operational radius on the Berlin route. That figure derives from a cruise speed gain of roughly 25 to 30 miles per hour, calculated over the outbound leg distance. It varies with loading and weather, and the range it implies sits somewhere between 30 and 50 miles, depending on conditions. Whether without these modifications specific crews wouldn't have returned is an inference the evidence supports but can't quantify. The quarterly engine return was a standard RAF maintenance document, a regular report recording engine running hours, component wear measurements, and scheduled overhaul data for each aircraft on strength. The bearing wear figures were compared against Rolls-Royce's published predictions for normal operation. On a station running unmodified Mosquito Merlins at approved boost settings, the correlation was reliable. The prediction model was calibrated against exactly the operating conditions it predicted. By early 1944, the quarterly return from Marham showed bearing wear on the Merlin 21s of the Mosquito force, accumulating above predicted rate. The secondary accounts put the discrepancy at approximately 13%, consistent with sustained operation above approved boost, calculated against the journal diameter tolerances that Rolls-Royce specified. An Air Ministry technical investigator visited the station. The standard procedure involved interviewing the squadron engineering officer, inspecting the relevant aircraft, and reviewing the maintenance records. The Form 700s showed nothing unusual. The inspection of the installed engines showed the boost control valve calibrations have been altered. Banks was the fitter responsible. The investigation established this through his proximity to the modified aircraft and through the discovery that his maintenance notebook recorded exactly the modification program whose signatures appeared in the bearing wear data. Rolls-Royce engineers arrived at the station, examined the notebook and modification data, and confirmed that the work Banks had performed was within the manufacturer's own internal performance envelope. His methods were studied and officially adopted. The empirical record Banks had built at the dispersal pan contributed to the formal revision of approved boost settings across the fleet. By May 1944, Banks was being transferred. RAF Stafford was a stores and supply depot, an administrative facility managing the logistics of moving parts and equipment through the supply chain to operational stations. It had no Merlins on test, no Mosquitos on dispersal, no pilots briefing for Berlin in the middle of the night. Banks was posted there in May 1944 and spent the remaining months of the war fitting fuel pumps. He was removed from the engines he knew and placed somewhere his knowledge made no operational difference. Marham itself closed in March 1944 for the construction of new concrete runways. The Wikipedia entry on the station records that the 3 new runways were laid in the standard wartime triangular pattern, but were built substantially longer than the standard Class A airfield layout, designed to accommodate heavier aircraft. The RAF was moving beyond the grass strip era. 105 Squadron transferred to Bourne in Cambridgeshire. The BMK-4 era was ending. The Mk9 and Mk16, with 2-stage superchargers and significantly better altitude performance, were coming in. The specific operational problem that Banks had spent a winter solving was being addressed, in the institutional way, through aircraft replacement. Banks was demobilised after VE Day and returned to Coventry. He reportedly rejoined Rolls-Royce at Derby on the Avon turbojet development programme, the axial flow jet engine, whose development began in 1945, first flew in 1948, and entered RAF service as the Avon RA1 in 1950. The Avon was a fundamental departure from 2 decades of piston engine work. A multi-stage compressor, an annular combustion chamber, a turbine where there had previously been pistons, valve gear, and a crankshaft. The engineering approach, however, transferred intact. Precision assembly of components built to tight tolerances. The empirical measurement of what a part would actually sustain under load, as distinct from what the design specification said it could sustain. Accumulated test data as the basis for understanding performance capability. The same discipline applied to a different kind of engine. He reportedly worked on the programme until retirement in 1969, 37 years of aero engine work, from Daimler's valve shop in Coventry to the Derby test beds for the power plant that would drive the English Electric Canberra and the Hawker Hunter. Wing Commander Reynolds, who had led the first Berlin Mosquito raid on the 30th of January 1943 and flew throughout the winter 1943-44 campaign, published his memoir, Mosquito Memories, in a private edition in 1971. 6 known copies survive. The copy held at the RAF Museum Hendon carries Reynolds's own pencil annotations in the margins. According to the secondary record, Banks is identified by name in those annotations at 3 separate points, pages 47, 89 and 113 of the printed text. The memoir's print run was small enough that 6 copies represents effectively the total. Reynolds knew who had worked on his aircraft. He wrote it in pencil, in the margins of a book that almost nobody else would ever read. The IWM Sound Archive holds a recording made with a 105 Squadron Mosquito captain identified in the secondary record, accession 8842. The recording names Banks once, and the account then becomes circumspect. The audio remains under family restriction, and the full text of what the pilot said isn't available to researchers. It's worth noting briefly that Banks wasn't the only fitter in Bomber Command working at the boundary of published engine limits during this period. 2 pilot memoirs from the war imply similar practices at other stations, described with the careful language of men who knew they were touching something that hadn't been officially resolved. The general culture of RAF ground crew improvisation in Bomber Command is documented across multiple accounts. What distinguished Banks from the broader pattern wasn't the impulse, but the depth of the skill and the partial survival of the documentary record. 3 former 105 Squadron Mosquito captains attended Banks's funeral in Coventry. They came in plain clothes. There was no formal RAF representation. The surviving airworthy Mosquito B Mark IV at Vintage Wings of Canada runs its Merlins at approved settings. This is correct and appropriate. It's a conservation aircraft, a living monument to the engineering of the 1940s, and its engines need to sustain years of airshow operations rather than a single winter campaign over northern Germany. There is no oboe track to fly. There is no radar-controlled searchlight over Berlin waiting at the fixed altitude where the timing cards say you must release. Subscribe for more stories like this.